Okay, now, Bill, Dr. Osmundson, you said for years you promoted fluoridation. How did you get pulled in on thinking and believing that it worked?
You know, when I was in school, of course, the dental school, they taught us that it was effective and safe and all the rest of that. And I had questions, but they gave reasonable responses. And when I was out in practice, the town that I lived at had fluoridated water in it, and the surrounding community did not. And people would come in with complaints, and I'd say, but I see the benefit on people's teeth, that there's a benefit from the fluoridation. And so I had a little game with my employees, and I'd say, okay, I'm going to tell you where the address is, or rough address is, whether they're getting fluoridation or not, of the next few patients that come on in. And so when they'd come in, I'd look in their mouths, and I'd say, okay, you live in town here, right? And they'd say, yes. Next patient would come in, and I'd say, well, you live up in Pack River Road, Rapid Lightning Road, somewhere on up there in the hills? And they'd say, yes. And I was right about 80% of the time. And so I was convinced in my mind that fluoridation reduced dental decay, except for one thing. I wasn't right. I wasn't looking at the effects of fluoridation, and I wasn't looking at the risks to the teeth of fluoridation. And so the teeth do become a little more shiny, glossy, harder looking, a little more glassy looking. There is a definite thing that you can see with the fluoride. But what I was really comparing more was the socioeconomics. People out in the country were poor. People in the city had more money. And when we separate out socioeconomics of the rich and the poor, we find that about 82% of the rich have very good to excellent teeth, and about 55% of the poor have very good to excellent teeth. And so we can't compare the rich and the poor. You can't take a community that has a bunch of wealthy people, compare it with a group of people, and they have fluoride, and compare that with the poor people who don't have fluoride.
Right.
You're going to always see that there's a problem because you're comparing socioeconomics.
So you needed to compare. You needed a study group that had the same socioeconomics together, I would guess, right?
Exactly. And when we start looking at that, and we start looking at the splitting and cracking of the teeth, and when we start looking at the fluoride, what we call fluoride bombs that happen in the teeth, the statistics are now showing that there's no benefit. In fact, the EPA scientists, through their union, gave probably the best summary that I've ever seen on fluoridation, and this really knocked my socks off when I first read it. In summary, we hold that the fluoridation is an unreasonable risk. That is, the toxicity of fluoride is so great and the purported benefits associated with it are so small, if there are any at all, that requiring every man, woman, and child in America to ingest it borders on criminal behavior on the part of governments. When I read that, I couldn't swallow. I paced up and down the floor of my office, and I said, what do you mean the risks? It's supposed to be safe. What do you mean the lack of benefits? There's lots of benefits. I've seen it. I know it. There must be there. And what is this criminal behavior on the part of governments? And with more study, I began to realize that what the EPA scientists are saying, and these are good scientists, these are good professionals that are talking about this, and what they've said is absolutely correct, that it is very unreasonable in risk. So one of the things I've done recently is look at the laws, and Paul has been talking about fluoride as a poison. And I thought, no, it's a drug, because when you're intending to treat people or mitigate disease or reduce dental decay, then it's a drug. And so I started looking at it as a drug, and I looked in the laws in pharmacy. However, when you look at fluoride and the laws are very, very clear that fluoride is a poison, because a poison means, for instance, in Washington, anything that will cause violent sickness or death with 3,889 milligrams or less. Well, we know that 15 milligrams of fluoride can cause death in a child. So to the Board of Pharmacy, my comment to them in Washington State is, look, you have to decide whether 15 is less than 3,889. And they look at me in silence. And I say, it doesn't take a lot of brains to realize that 15 is less. In Oregon and in Vermont and other places, they'll talk about 50 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. Well, an adult, 5 milligrams, and that's defined as a poison. But an adult, 5 milligrams per kilogram of fluoride will cause death. So in every state that I've looked at it, fluoride is defined by law as a poison. Now, most drugs are poisons, and that's why they're given out as a prescription or they're habit forming. But legend drugs are poisons.
Okay, now we're gonna find out how it got into our drinking water and what's behind it, because there must be some politics, Paul and Bill. But Bill, because you're a dentist, why has the ADA, the American Dental Association, for over 50 years jumped up and down and endorsed this?
Well, they say that it's highly effective, but Sharon Begley in Newsweek on her article on science probably said it better than anyone else on second thought. You know, scientists are supposed to change their minds when evidence undercuts their views. When scientists have an intellectual stake in a particular side of a debate, well, they just don't look anymore. They just believe. So we've got a belief system here by the scientific dentists. That's one major thing. They just believe. They refuse to look at the science opposing their belief system. And they, when I call them up and I say, you know, I'd like to come over and talk to you about the science of this, they refuse. The Department of Health refused. They will not discuss or talk it. It's almost like if they don't talk about it, then it makes their theory safe. It makes their theory okay because they don't want to talk about it anymore.
You know, I can add to that. In 2006, the National Research Council produced a 507-page review of fluoride in drinking water. They looked at the toxicity. Over 1,000 references. It took the panel 3.5 years to produce this report, 507 pages, 1,100 or so references. On the day that was released, and they concluded that the safe drinking water standard was not protective of health and needed to be lowered, and that was at 4 parts per million, needs to be lowered from 4 parts per million. On the same day that was released, the ADA came out and said this report is irrelevant to water fluoridation at 1 part per million. I mean, they didn't have time to read the report, study the report, look at the references, do a health risk assessment, or any of that stuff, and yet they were able to dismiss it just like that.
Paul, is there one company that manufactures this, that, you know, gets the remnants from the fertilizers and puts it together?
There are a number of chemical companies that act as distributors, but of course it's the big phosphate companies down in Florida mainly. So Cargill is one of them.
Are we talking about a $1 billion industry? Or?
No, I think it's the phosphate fertilizer industry is certainly.
No, I mean the fluoride.
The fluoride. Bill Hersley from the EPA, one of the scientists that Bill Osmundson was talking about just a moment ago, he estimated maybe $200 million a year is the swing from what you would pay to get rid of it as a hazardous waste and what they get as an income. So it's not small change, but personally, I don't think it's the tail that's wagging this dog. I think Bill has it more on his.
Okay, but Paul, you mean if they didn't put it in the water, they'd have to get rid of it as a hazardous waste,
or use it in some other way, like there's the suggestion.
Okay, hold on. We'll be right back.